Welcome to the video homily for Easter Day. Even as we are scattered as a community, we remember today that Christ is risen. We've just spent perhaps the strangest Easter day ever. I know it's the strangest Easter day I've ever had. Normally Easter's about family gatherings, holidays, celebrating the resurrection together in joyful worship. But this year we've been separated from one another and away from our families, or perhaps even just catching up with them on Zoom. And of course, although the internet's been a boon over the past few weeks for keeping in touch, it doesn't really make up for the real thing, like a warm hug from a grandchild or sharing a meal with those we love. It's been hard to see resurrection hope while we're in the midst of this pandemic. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's hard to see how we're going to get back to normal life. But of course, there are other times in our lives when it's really hard to see resurrection. It's hard to see how we're going to get better when we have a difficult diagnosis, or when we live every day with pain. The answer to all these things is always, but God. But God. That's the thing about faith and about trust in the hope of the resurrection. Whenever we find ourselves in the middle of a Holy Week experience, when everything seems completely hopeless, whether that's a terrifying pandemic that makes us come face to face with our mortality, or when the share market fails, or the housing market crashes, or we lose our job, and it seems like we've lost everything, then even in the darkest of situations in our lives, Easter hope, joy out of ashes, are always possible. The Christian story tells us that Christ is indeed risen. It tells us that death and darkness and hopelessness have been conquered and overcome. But between Holy Week and the resurrection, we need to wait. Wait. Because God is always at work. And because with God, everything is possible, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes between the promise and the blessing, it does take a long time. And we have to keep remembering, but God, with God, everything is possible. Easter lies ahead. But even for the disciples on that resurrection day, it wasn't easy to see. Mary and the women thought that the risen Jesus was the gardener. When the angel spoke to them, they were absolutely terrified, because the last thing on their mind was that the impossible had happened, that Jesus had risen from the dead. They just were not looking. When the women told the disciples, they thought it was a bit of idle women's gossip. And weeks later, we find these same disciples still locked in their room, terrified and hiding away, definitely not living in the light of resurrection. The lectionary reading for the end of Easter Day is the story of disciples walking together along the road to Emmaus. And I encourage you to take a moment to read this story from Luke's Gospel, chapter 24 today. These disciples were walking back home from watching the crucifixion, full of sadness and loss, when a stranger joins them. This stranger discussed theology with them, explained why all this had to happen. And it tells us these disciples started to get engaged and interested. So when they got home, they invited him to come in to share a meal with them. And as he broke bread with them in their home, they recognized him. Around the table, as they shared food, he broke bread, and their hearts were opened and touched. And then they saw the resurrection for themselves. Understanding didn't happen in a flash. They didn't get it straight away. Talking theology piqued their interest, got them interested, but it was gathered over a meal that they recognized him, that they knew him, and that they stumbled across the resurrection. I saw a beautiful Facebook post this week, and it said, maybe this year we celebrate Easter differently. Maybe we celebrate the resurrection just as the disciples did, alone in the silence, hoping that the faith outweighs the fear. Tonight, on this Easter day, as you share a meal together, or even if you're eating alone because you're in isolation, remember this story. If you're physically eating alone, remember that we are all, the All Saints community, with you. We are with you and you are with us on this Easter day. Pray that you may know the risen Christ in food and drink. Pray that the good news of the resurrection will permeate your life to the core, will fill you with hope. Yes, even right in the middle of a frightening pandemic or whatever else it is in your life that terrifies you, that takes your breath away. Just keep remembering, even in the darkness, but God. May it remind you that God is with you in every single situation, and no matter what the Holy Week experience you are living through, Easter joy, Easter hope, and resurrection lie just ahead. The Lord be with you. Christ is risen. Alleluia.